Every Nintendo character got their start somewhere. So today we're looking at every Nintendo series to see where they first began. During the early days of Nintendo's conquest to take over the gaming industry, arcade machines were everywhere. Home consoles were not the standard and wouldn't be for some time. And one of the most notable machines during this time was Donkey Kong. This was the first time we were introduced to Mario under the moniker Jumpman, doing what he does best, jumping over anything that comes in his path. But you may be surprised that this is also the first time that we saw Donkey Kong.
Oh my god!
The game is as classic can be, with incredibly simple arcade gameplay where you're just going for a high score. And though this gave us the first appearance of two of Nintendo's most iconic characters, an argument can be made that this wasn't the first appearance of Mario because that wasn't his name in this game. Because the first time he donned the name Mario was in the Mario Bros title for the Game & Watch. A game where Mario and Luigi load bottles onto a truck. Since this was made for the Game & Watch, it is a very simple title. It did end up getting remade for the Game & Watch Gallery series on the Game Boy, giving Mario and Luigi a modern facelift so they actually look like the characters they're supposed to represent. But a few months after the Game & Watch, an arcade cabinet with the same name released, which gave us the now famous Mario Bros arcade machine. Similar to Donkey Kong, this has Mario and Luigi doing what they do best, destroying wildlife. Mario and Luigi have been tasked with cleaning up the sewer system. But unlike a traditional Mario game that we know today, Mario cannot just simply jump on an enemy. He has to hit the ground underneath them and then kick them in the face. Unlike the Game & Watch title, this introduced a lot of things that would become standards in the Mario universe. This was the first appearance of pipes, coins, and POW blocks, things that would go on to become staples in the Mario formula going forward. But Mario, as we know him today, wasn't a thing until Super Mario Bros. For the NES and Famicom. This is arguably the most important video game ever released. Though it was not the first appearance of Mario, it was the one that set the standard going forward for every Mario game that we have ever gotten. This title paved the way for all future 2D platformers, with incredibly simple gameplay that anyone could pick up and understand. Mario's goal was to get to the end of a level and slide down a flagpole. But along the way, there were enemies like Goombas, Koopa Troopas, and Piranha Plants. And depending on how they touch Mario, he would die instantly. This introduced so many things that have become staples in the Mario formula. And though he got his start as the playable character in Donkey Kong, this is the game that most people would recognize him from. And since then, he has become the poster boy for Nintendo and video games across the world. And that led Nintendo to ask one simple question.
How can we milk this for as much money as possible?
Spin-offs have been popular forever. Whenever something gets popular, there is always a chance to make more money from it. And Nintendo did just that by slapping Mario onto every possible game that you can think of. And one of the first examples of that was F1 racing. Mario racing games are absolutely iconic, but the first one was not that great. This only released in Japan and was an F1 racing simulator for the Famicom. You allegedly race as Mario, but outside of the cover art, there really isn't anything Mario about this. And it feels like Mario was just slapped on the cover to sell more copies. And pretty much the same thing happened with Mario's first sports outing, being a golf game appropriately titled Golf.
Hey, what are you playing? Golf.
No, I meant like, what's the name of the game?
Golf. The game is called Golf. Get away. Be gone from me.
Golf was released on both the Game Boy and the NES. And it is a hotly debated topic whether this counts as the first Mario sports game or not. On the cover of the NES version, there was a character that looked vaguely like Mario. But in the Japan exclusive Wii game Captain Rainbow, we find out this wasn't Mario, it was actually a different character named Asan. One of the many names that Mario was referred to before they landed on what he is today. And though they mentioned the NES version, they don't actually explicitly say the Game Boy version is not Mario. Although these are considered to be the first Mario spin-off games, they would ultimately evolve into their own franchises, with F1 racing being a distant relative of the Mario Kart franchise, one of the most popular gaming franchises of all time that started with Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo. And Mario, being the system-selling character he is, kept getting more games that introduced more characters that ended up getting their own spin-offs, with one of the most notable being Yoshi. In a lot of bundles for the SNES, Nintendo offered Super Mario World as a pack-in title. But this wasn't just any old Mario adventure, it also gave us the first appearance of Yoshi, the gluttonous dinosaur who's gone on to have a bunch of his own games that started out with Yoshi. A lot of early Nintendo games didn't have the best names. Like a lot of games during this era, this released for both the Game Boy and the NES. It's a simple puzzle game clearly inspired by Tetris where you match two Mario characters together in order to clear them from the board. But unlike Tetris where you're rotating blocks, this time you're having Mario spin some plates around.
Who wanted this?
I am a big fan of puzzle games, but this has always felt extremely unnecessary. It feels like Nintendo saw how great Super Mario World was and how popular of a character Yoshi was becoming, so they slapped Yoshi on the side of a generic puzzle game just to sell more units. Don't get me wrong, it's a lot of fun, but you could have replaced any of these characters with someone else and it wouldn't have changed the game at all. And though this was technically the first standalone Yoshi title, the one that comes to most people's mind is Yoshi's Island. Its full legal name is Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, but in this game you directly control Yoshi for the entirety of your adventure. And he's given his own moveset like flutter kicks and the ability to consume enemies and throw them as ammunition. That makes him really stand out from how he was in Mario World to feel like his own playable character. But of course Yoshi wasn't the only playable character to get his own games, with Mario's slender younger brother's first game being Luigi's Hammer Toss, a game for the Game & Watch toy watch.
I don't own this.
Though it was technically his first standalone video game, it was also just a toy watch, so the first one that he ever got for a home console was Mario's Missing. It's really not much better. Mario's Missing was an educational game that used a lot of the same assets as Super Mario World, but this time you play as Luigi because Mario got kidnapped. So Luigi, being the great guy he is, goes on a quest to get his brother back. And he does that by returning stolen historical objects.
This fills me with unyielding rage.
It's a shame that Luigi's first standalone home console game was a educational game, because the first thing that comes to mind when I mention Luigi is geography. My favorite part about this game was when I realized that I had free will and I didn't have to continue playing it and I could move on to a different game. But the last man with a mustache and overalls that I want to talk about is Wario, who made his first appearance in Super Mario Land 2, The 6 Golden Coins. The Super Mario Land series were incredible games, bringing all of the fun of a Mario platformer to a handheld console. And Wario was designed to be the complete polar opposite of Mario, and served as the main antagonist of the game. And he ended up becoming so popular that he took over the Mario Land series, making Wario Land. Similar to how Yoshi's Island took the Super Mario World namesake, the full name of this game is Wario Land Super Mario Land 3. But outside of also being a 2D platformer, it feels very different than the other Mario Land games. Wario Land had a much larger focus on treasure hunting and exploration, with most of the levels having hidden exits and there being 15 separate treasures for you to collect on your journey. So even though it looks very similar to a typical 2D Mario adventure, it did a lot of things different. And Wario went on to have a bunch of different adventures outside of this, with titles like WarioWare and Wario World, and it's crazy to think that all of these games stemmed from Donkey Kong. But during the arcade era, that wasn't the only game that Nintendo had out there, with one of their most popular arcade cabinets being Punch-Out! For its time, Punch-Out! Was a really interesting idea, being an arcade cabinet that used two monitors instead of the standard one, with one screen showing the details about the fighters and the other showing the actual fight itself. And it's needless to say that this game was a hit.
But I don't have a drum set.
There were some really interesting design choices, like having the character you play as have a wire frame so you could see through him and see who you're fighting. But the first home console Punch-Out! Game that we got was Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! And this brought all of the fun of Punch-Out! To homes across the world. You play as a scrappy young boxer named Little Mac who is fighting his way to be the best boxer in the world. And similar to the arcade game, you would beat through a bunch of boxers, ending with fighting Mike Tyson, one of the most overpowered characters in Nintendo's history. At the time, Mike Tyson was one of the most popular athletes in the world, and having him help promote this game ended up expanding the reach a lot more than it would have on its own. But unfortunately, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Ended up being the peak of the series, with none of the other games reaching the same level of hype that this did. And unfortunately, the last Punch-Out! Game that we got ended up releasing in 2009 for the Wii, and we haven't seen another game in the franchise since.
Maybe if Nintendo would stop making all of these fitness boxing games, we could get a new Punch-Out! Why are you yelling? I have strong feelings about this.
But by this point, Nintendo had infiltrated the home console market, with the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System being smash hits. And during this transition, the philosophy of game design shifted as well, where instead of trying to convince people to spend just one more quarter, they now wanted them to continue playing for as long as possible. And this led to a bunch of brand new series being developed for these consoles, with one of the most notable being The Legend of Zelda. This was developed right alongside Super Mario Bros. With the opposite goal in mind. Mario was a simple linear adventure that you could go on in short bursts, but The Legend of Zelda brought you on a journey, giving you a world to explore with so many secrets to uncover. And though this was the first, it was also very different to any Zelda game that we've gotten since, with the most accurate comparison to a modern game being Breath of the Wild. Starting with games like A Link to the Past, Zelda brought you on a more linear, structured journey. That's not to say it didn't have the same sense of adventure, but The Legend of Zelda just drops you into this vast world and allows you to explore it and uncover all of its secrets on your own. This was the first time that we ever got to play as Link, something that would go on to confuse parents around the world for decades.
No, for the 5th time, the boy is Link and you're on a quest to save Zelda. I don't understand!
Your mission is to rescue Princess Zelda, and along the way, gather the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom. This was not the first adventure game that brought you on the hero's journey, but it set the standard for adventure games going forward. But 1996 also saw the creation of 2 other iconic Nintendo series, the first of which being Metroid. I am a massive fan of what Metroid would go on to become, but I don't really enjoy this one as much as any of the other games. Metroid introduced us to Samus's adventures in space for the first time. Space pirates have captured some creatures known as Metroids and plan on turning them into powerful biological weapons. So the Galactic Federation sends Samus to go destroy the Metroids and save the planet. An incredible idea, especially for the time with movies like Alien taking over the world. The concept is fantastic, but the gameplay is like getting your toenails ripped off by a semi-truck. Like most Metroid games, Samus starts off incredibly frail, but gets stronger over time as you play the game. But more than any other Metroid game, Samus starts off borderline useless. Of course, this does get better as you play, but the early sections are especially brutal. When you play games like this or The Legend of Zelda, you really need a guide to hold your hand and tell you what to do and where to go. The NES was an incredible console, but a lot of games were missing features like a map to make it easier for players to navigate through the world. And with Metroid in particular, a lot of set pieces and locations look very similar, making it so easy to get lost that if you don't have a guide or a map, you're kinda just flying blind. But what Metroid did for game development as a whole cannot be understated. And though the first game doesn't hold up as well as something like Super Metroid, it is still one of the most important early Nintendo games of all time. But if you want to experience this without all of the early NES quirks, there was a remake for the Game Boy Advance called Metroid Zero Mission, which brings you on the same adventure but feels more like a modern Metroid game. But the last Nintendo IP that got its start in 1986 was Kid Icarus. For a long time, this was more or less a forgotten Nintendo series, but with the release of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Pit got his second chance to shine. Kid Icarus is an interesting game because similar to Metroid, the early stages are absolutely brutal. This is an action platformer where you play as Pit, who's trying to escape the underworld where Medusa had him trapped, and your goal is to get back to heaven. Armed with a bow and arrow and a positive attitude, the earliest worlds have Pit climbing straight up out of the underworld. But similar to the original Super Mario Bros., this game features ratchet scrolling, which means you can only move one direction, which is all well and good, except for the fact that if you fall back down, you die instantly. It took me a good amount of time to get used to how this game functions, but after the first 3 worlds or so, it starts to get much more manageable. Kid Icarus is a really interesting series because it came out around the same time as Zelda and Metroid, but never reached the same level of acclaim. With the most recent installment being Kid Icarus Uprising for the 3DS, a game that is nothing like the originals, but is honestly the best in the series. Maybe someday Nintendo will take the franchise more seriously, but as of right now, I don't have very high hopes. But a few years later, an interesting new series would debut in Japan known as Mother.
Oh, that game looks so cool. When can we have it? Oh, really soon, I promise.
The Mother series has been neglected by Nintendo ever since it was first created. The first game that we got in the West was known as Earthbound, aka Mother 2. Of the Earthbound/Mother trilogy, this is definitely the one that people talk about the least, but I still think it's pretty good. I will say right off the bat, this game is very weird. You get jumped by a lamp within the first 10 seconds of playing, so if that doesn't set the standard for what's to come, I don't think anything will. I hadn't played this in a long time, and I forgot how much of an NES RPG this game was, because there are definitely some quirks that make this feel a little bit more dated than any other game in the series, mostly the random encounters, which happen a lot and are pretty annoying. And I know a lot of people have reservations about going back and playing NES era RPGs because they were a lot to deal with. But compared to all of them out there, I think this is one that holds up the best. The characters you meet along the way and Nintendo's journey as a whole is really strange, but in a way that makes you want to keep playing the game because you have no idea what could possibly happen next. You can absolutely skip this and go straight into Earthbound and you won't miss anything that is that major, but the series started with this game and I'm just glad that we got it in the West at all, and even though it's been 10 years since then, I'm still holding out hope that eventually we'll get an official release of Mother 3. But at least if you want to play this game, you can do so pretty easily whether it's on the Wii U or the Switch, unlike Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light, which originally released exclusively in Japan but was a limited release eShop title for the Switch in 2020. There was about a 3-month window where you could buy this on the eShop, and if you didn't, then you are completely out of luck.
Yeah, they got me.
I bought this because I'm a sucker and eventually I wanted to play it, and I am in no way defending the limited digital release of this game, and after playing it, I regret my purchase even more. The original Fire Emblem as a proof of concept is a very cool idea. It's great to look back and see where a series began, but I can't think of a single good reason to play this over its remake on the DS, because in a similar but far worse way to Earthbound Beginnings, this feels like an NES RPG through and through. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing because there are some phenomenal JRPGs that came out on the NES, but this just really isn't one of them. The story is told before and after a battle, and while it's pretty solid, it's also very hard to get through. I am somewhat new to Fire Emblem, but more than any other game, this feels incredibly dated. Whether it's the bar graphs instead of numbers in a battle, or manually selecting every single troop you want to have make an action, most of the time I put into this game was just me being genuinely confused more than anything else. And whether it's the gaming historian in me, or the crippling fear of not being able to buy it after a certain date, I don't regret buying it to see how the series began, but I also would never play this over Shadow Dragon on the DS. But in the same year we got this, we also saw the release of Nintendo's brand new 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo. And alongside the launch title that gave us Yoshi, we also got a brand new racing game, F-Zero. Yet another one of Nintendo's neglected series, F-Zero was an awesome idea, bringing high-speed, futuristic racing to consoles across the world. The original F-Zero is incredibly simple. You just race and try and come in first place. But this isn't any old racing game because it can be incredibly difficult. There's not a lot here content-wise because there's only 4 selectable cars and 3 separate levels of difficulty, which means you can see pretty much everything the game has to offer in just a few sessions. But what kept me coming back as a kid and to this day is the high-speed action the series offers. If you drop below a certain place, you are out, and if your car takes too much damage, it explodes in a fabulous fashion. The jump in visual and gameplay quality from the NES to the Super Nintendo was massive. Playing racing games on the NES can be a bit of a chore, but for the first time they were able to capture real speed. And though this has become one of the series that Nintendo doesn't make games for very often, you can pick up and play pretty much any game in the franchise and have a great time. But the original is not only one of the best in the series, but one of Nintendo's best launch titles of all time. And it's crazy to think that the one thing this character is known best for wasn't actually in any of his games.
Falcon! Aw, dang it. Oh my god!
The first time that we saw the adorable pink puffball Kirby, he wasn't actually pink. Kirby's first appearance was in Kirby's Dream Land for the Game Boy. An interesting title that is surprisingly very similar to a lot of Kirby games that we still get to this day. The major difference here compared to any other Kirby title is that his signature copy ability is not in this game. He can still suck up enemies and shoot them out as ammunition, which is nice, but at its core, this is just a 2D platformer starring Kirby. But in place of the copy ability, there were some items on each stage that you could use that had different effects, like a bomb that explodes, a microphone that makes a very loud noise, and some super spicy curry that makes Kirby spit fire. But out of every Nintendo series, Kirby really hit the ground running. And what we got with his first adventure was very similar to the other ones that we would get in the future. And a few years later, we got yet another new Nintendo series with Star Fox. Thanks to a special chip inside the cartridge, this was one of the first games that offered a true 3D experience from Nintendo. And this technology was groundbreaking. Though it had to run at a lower frame rate and resolution than most games at the time, this was a monumental step forward for Nintendo as a whole. And I can't think of a better way to use this technology than to make a new series where you play as a fox pilot who fights a giant space monkey.
What is even happening?
The general plot is that Corneria is being attacked by a giant space monkey and it is your job to destroy him and save the galaxy. You play as Fox McCloud, who alongside his crew is tasked with going to the planet Venom and destroying the evil Andross once and for all. But there are 3 ways to do it: the easy way, the medium way, and the hard way. It may seem like a no-brainer to go the easy way, but if you go the hard way, you do more damage to Andross in the long run. And of course, this offers 3 distinct playthroughs so you don't experience the entire game in 20 minutes. This is another series that Nintendo has all but forgotten at this point, and honestly, it's a shame. The modern Star Fox games have not lived up to the revolutionary start the series had. And ever since Star Fox 64, they failed to reach the same heights that made the series as notable as it is. But I truly believe it would only take one good game to completely rebuild this series' reputation. And I'm hoping we get that because I have a Star Fox-sized hole in my heart that cannot be filled until we do. But the next new Nintendo IP would go on to become the largest media franchise in the world, with Pokemon Red and Green releasing in Japan and completely dominating the global market. Pokemon was the perfect storm. The Game Boy was already an incredibly successful console, and with the RPG craze of the Super Nintendo being stronger than ever, having a mobile, turn-based RPG released for the console was a no-brainer. But what separated Pokemon from every other similar game is that this was an experience that was meant to be shared with friends. The catchphrase for Pokemon in the West was "gotta catch 'em all." And having this be a split release meant that you had to have a friend or sibling who had the other version of the game in order to collect every single Pokemon that was available in the Kanto region. The initial release of the game in Japan had Pokemon Red and Green, but in the West, we got Pokemon Red and Blue. But it didn't matter where you were located in the world, the experience was the same. Pokemon was everywhere. You couldn't leave your house without seeing something Pokemon related because it had taken over every industry. The gameplay was incredibly simple, being a fancy version of rock, paper, scissors, where you would battle your way through 8 gyms in order to become the Pokemon League champion. There were 151 Pokemon to collect, and the heart of the experience came from sharing it with friends. Whether you were battling, trading, or just talking to your friends about what you had completed since the last time you saw them, Pokemon Red, Blue, and Green quickly took over the world and are still the best-selling games in the entire franchise. And during the time that Pokemon was taking over the world, Nintendo was also releasing a brand new home console, the Nintendo 64. A console that didn't go on to spawn many new characters outside of the rare characters that are now owned by Microsoft, but did end up creating at least 2 notable franchises, the first of which being Mario Party. Mario has been spun off into pretty much everything you could possibly imagine. But Mario Party is a unique one because it is a video game take on a board game.
Yeah, what's next, Mario Poker? Oh, come on!
The N64 had something that no other Nintendo console did: 4 slots for controllers. Having the ability to have 4 players simultaneous co-op was a massive step forward, and it paved the way for some of the best couch co-op experiences that friends could have. And what better way to utilize that technology than have a board game? Party games were an awesome new idea, allowing you and a couple friends to play at the same time. But Mario Party managed to blend the idea of a video game and a board game perfectly by adding mini games at the end of every turn, with a selection of 50 separate mini games that could be pretty much anything. And outside of some that caused life-threatening injuries, these were pretty good. But unlike a typical board game that came with only one board, Mario Party had a collection to choose from. For some reason that I still don't really understand, they're ranked by difficulty. I've never really looked at a board game and thought this is going to be too hard, but having a selection of various boards means that you can play this so many times and not get the same experience twice. Mario Party was a great first party game, and the perfect way to get people who had never played video games into the medium for the first time. It was simple and accessible, and anybody with 2 brain cells could figure out how to play. But this wasn't the only notable franchise that got its start on this console, with Super Smash Bros. Coming out of left field and becoming an overnight phenomenon. This was the first game to be considered a platform fighter. Up until this, a typical fighting game was more or less something like Street Fighter, where it was 2 characters mashing combos at each other, hoping to kill the other person first. But Super Smash Bros. Took the fighting game genre a completely different direction, not only making it more accessible for the average person, but also changing the goal entirely. Every attack in Smash Bros. Adds percentage to the character who is hit. The higher your percentage, the farther you fly back, with the ultimate goal of knocking your opponent off the stage. And this was a brilliant idea, but even better was to have Nintendo characters from different franchises beating the snot out of each other.
Great, because everybody always wanted to know what would happen if Link fought Jigglypuff.
Smash Bros. Has gone on to be a celebration of video game history. But the initial lineup of characters was pretty bare bones. But Smash Bros. And Mario Party on their own would go on to be institutions for Nintendo going forward, with their future games consistently being some of the best-selling games on all of Nintendo's consoles. But the N64 didn't live a very long life. It would go on to be replaced by the GameCube in 2001, another console that didn't live a very long life. But the GameCube wasn't the first console that Nintendo released in 2001, with the legendary Game Boy Advance launching earlier that year. A handheld console that brought the power of the Super Nintendo on the go. This was Nintendo's first 16-bit handheld console, and with it came a couple new series of its own, one of the earliest of which being Golden Sun. This was the first JRPG that came to the console, and it left a lasting impact. Golden Sun never reached the same level of popularity as series like Final Fantasy or Pokemon, but it still offered a home console quality JRPG experience available on the go, something that just a few years earlier didn't seem possible. This was developed by Camelot, the same studio that would bring us hits like Mario Tennis Ultra Smash.
It's about time for another crusade.
They're primarily known for their work on Mario sports titles, but they ended up making a phenomenal JRPG. Which isn't a surprise because that's what they started off doing. It didn't do anything to pioneer the formula or push the genre a new direction, but it did offer a great world to explore full of incredible characters. The world of Weird is full of diverse cultures that you get to experience firsthand. But what Golden Sun nailed the most were the puzzles and dungeons. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the dungeons here rival that of what Zelda was able to make on the same console. And that is the biggest compliment that a brand new series can achieve. And the biggest problem with Golden Sun is that it just kinda ends halfway through the story. They did release a sequel on the Game Boy Advance, which is great, but I don't think it was a good idea to just stop the story halfway through. I understand that why they did it was due to technical limitations, but this has just never made sense. But still, Golden Sun is yet another one of Nintendo's series that they could make a game for but are choosing not to, and I'm hoping someday that we'll at least get a remake. But the Game Boy Advance was just getting started with a brand new turn-based RPG coming to the console known as Advance Wars. This was developed by Intelligent Systems, the same people who brought us Fire Emblem. Now technically the series could go all the way as far back as Famicom Wars, a series of war-based games that came out for, you guessed it, the Famicom, but the series kind of bounced around with different names until this title. Fans of Fire Emblem can thank this series for getting the games out of Japan for the first time. Advance Wars was a game that I neglected to play until recently, and I regret every decision I have ever made, because this is exactly my kind of game and I absolutely love it. There's a short tutorial you have to play before continuing onto the main game, and at first I didn't really love that I had to play a tutorial and I couldn't just go in blind, but once I got through it, I had a hard time putting this game down. You play as one of the commanding officers of the Orange Star Army. Each level is an active war zone where you take control of your army and try and rout the enemy by taking control of cities and fighting enemies in your path. There are different types of units like soldiers and tanks that you can use, but the coolest part about this game is that it had multiplayer and not in the way that you think. Of course, there was link cable connectivity, which was nice, but if you only had one console, you could take turns passing it back and forth with friends, which is an idea that is so simple but also incredibly brilliant. And I'm surprised other Nintendo turn-based RPGs didn't implement a similar idea. But at the end of the day, Advance Wars isn't Nintendo's most popular franchise by any means, but if you're a fan of tactical, turn-based RPGs, then I guarantee that you will like what you see here. But 2001 was still going, with a couple more games that would go on to be massive Nintendo franchises, the first of which being on the GameCube with Pikmin. Pikmin is the perfect game for people who want to control 100 dim-witted children at one time.
I would rather die.
To spare a 2-hour lecture on the development of Pikmin, this is a very interesting series. You play as Captain Olimar, who crash lands on a mysterious planet and in order to escape needs the help of Pikmin to rebuild his ship. Using his MLB pitching arm and his whistle, Olimar is able to control the Pikmin in order to have them do various tasks. Whether it's carrying pieces of the ship or beating bugs to death, everything that you do during the day matters. Because if you don't make it back to the ship in time, then you will die. You have a total of 30 days to get all of the pieces you need to escape, and at the end of the day, you're given a report card to tell you how good you're doing. I have beaten through the first Pikmin game so many times, and every time I do a little bit better than the last time, except for the last time where I didn't do as good and I have not lived it down. But it's that drive to do it better and faster that really got me hooked on this series to begin with. I'm glad Nintendo is finally realizing that there are living, breathing Pikmin fans out there who want to play these games, and I just hope we don't have to wait until 2034 to get a new game. But one of Nintendo's most popular franchises of all time got its start on the GameCube, and that was Animal Crossing.
Well, actually, this came out on the N64. True. But I can't read Japanese. That is a fair point.
Though it initially released as Animal Forest on the N64, Animal Crossing has gone on to become an absolute monster, with the original Animal Forest getting an expanded global release with Animal Crossing, a life simulation game where you play as a villager who moves to a town full of animals to start a new life. And this instantly became one of my favorite games to come back to on the GameCube. You show up to the town flat broke and you need to pay Tom Nook for a new house, but considering you don't have enough money, he then puts you in indentured servitude. So you're forced to work at this shop to pay off the house until he runs out of tasks for you to do, and then you are on your own to figure out a way to make money to pay back your loan. From entry to entry, the core gameplay of Animal Crossing doesn't change all that much. And though it's probably because it's the first one I played, but this has always been one of my favorite in the entire franchise. Compared to every other entry in the series, the villager dialogue here is the best, where a lot of the villagers can be really quick to anger and will just say some really rude things unprovoked. But this is a series that is meant to be enjoyed for years at a time, building bonds with your villagers and helping make the town look as beautiful as you can. And no matter how many games come out, this will always be one of my favorite because I like getting yelled at. And the last new series on the GameCube came out just before the end of the console's life, and that was Chibi Robo. And I'm just gonna say right now that this game is really weird, but in the best way possible. Of course, you play as Chibi Robo, who was given as a gift to Jenny from her father for her birthday. And your entire goal is to make sure that this house is spotless. And you do so by doing the household chores like picking up trash and scrubbing the floors.
So it's pretty much a Roomba with legs? Yeah, pretty much. Give me every one you have.
I am a big fan of weird games, and this scratches an itch I didn't even know I had. By cleaning the house, Chibi Robo earns happy points, which he uses to move up the leaderboard and earn battery upgrades. And though the gameplay is really good, the thing that this game does the best is have an interesting environment. Exploring the Sanderson house at a small scale is really fun, especially because the toys in the house go off the Toy Story rule set and come alive at night. And whether you're cleaning during the day or at night, there is always something engaging happening that will keep you invested. And though none of the other games in the franchise are really like this at all, I would love Nintendo to give us a new game in this franchise and show Chibi Robo some real love. But by this point, the DS had already released. But the Game Boy Advance wasn't done yet and still had one more brand new game series that would come to be known as Rhythm Heaven. But the first Rhythm Heaven game never got an official release outside of Japan. So the only way to experience this is to play a fan translation, which is exactly what I did.
Get him!
I put a few hours into this, and honestly, I don't have that much to say. Rhythm Heaven is a series of mini-games in a style very similar to WarioWare, where you're hitting buttons in rhythm with the music that's playing. And it works really well, but this is probably my least favorite in the series. That's not to say this is bad, because it is really engaging, but compared to the other games that I've played in the series, like the one on the DS and the 3DS, this just, for better or for worse, felt way too simple. I'm glad I played it, and I'm still surprised Nintendo has never came out and released this outside of Japan, but if you're not able to play this entry, you're really not missing that much. But this is where things start to get pretty complicated, because on the Wii, we saw the release of a brand new series for Nintendo known as Xenoblade. And the simplest possible answer would be the first game in this series being the original Xenoblade, which released on the Wii, but technically the Xeno series is a lot more complicated than that, with the first technical game in this series being Xenogears, which released on the PlayStation. Xenogears is looked at as one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, developed by Squaresoft, who at the time was just continuously putting out incredible games. And though this is technically the first game in the series, it also never released on a Nintendo console. So to spare overcomplicating this, I'm just gonna talk about Xenoblade. Xenoblade Chronicles originally released on the Nintendo Wii. I bought this on a whim as a kid because I thought the box art was really cool, and I have never looked back. Xenoblade is a JRPG that plays differently than a lot of others that you may have tried, with the combat feeling more in line with something like an MMORPG than anything else, where the character's moves will have cooldowns, but the moves themselves will work better depending on where you are positioned relative to the enemy. But the best part about any of the Xenoblade games is the story and world you get to explore. The exploration and environments that you see in this world are nothing short of breathtaking. And ever since I first played this, it has quickly become one of my favorite JRPG series of all time. There are a ton of ways to play the original, whether it's on the 3DS or the Switch, and if you're looking for a game to kill over 100 hours, then this is a good choice. But in the modern years, Nintendo has slowed down the amount of new franchises that they've been releasing, with one of the most recent coming out on the Wii U with Splatoon. Nintendo's first attempt at a competitive shooter, but just like with something like Smash Bros, ended up redefining the entire format. Splatoon is a competitive shooter where your goal isn't to rack up as many kills as possible. Instead, you're trying to cover the terrain with as much of your team's color ink as you can. And though at first I wasn't really sold on the premise because Nintendo doesn't have the best history with online multiplayer, this ended up being a series where I have dumped in hundreds of hours and I don't regret a single moment. Having the goal be shifted away from getting kills makes the focus on PvP more or less irrelevant. You could spend the entire game avoiding fights, but as long as you're painting the ground, you would still be helping your team. Whether you're playing the single player or the multiplayer, there is a lot of fun to be had. But outside of playing it to see where the series began, you're better off just playing one of the more modern games, so you can really experience everything that this game has to offer. And the most recent new series that Nintendo has released is ARMS.
I prefer legs. Get out.
Giving credit where credit's due, ARMS is a really interesting game. And though it's personally not for me, I do understand the appeal for a lot of people. ARMS is a futuristic long-distance boxing simulator, something I never thought I would say, that takes advantage of the Joy-Con's motion controls in order to simulate real boxing. And the motion controls work really well, even though I personally ended up just playing on a controller. And there was a surprising amount of variety in the game, but I never really ended up playing this for more than 20 minutes at a time. With other more competitive fighting games like Smash on the console, I ended up just gravitating more towards that. So outside of playing this with friends on occasion, I never really ended up falling in love with this like I did with most of the other series. That being said, I would love it if Nintendo decided to make more games in this franchise. And after playing all of their different IPs, I'm just excited for whatever Nintendo's going to make in the future.